Hi, everybody. I'm Dan, and I write horror, science fiction, and fantasy, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, we are going to talk about Eberron Rising from the Last War, which is the 5th edition campaign setting book for Eberron. Rising from the Last War makes it sound like it might be an adventure supplement or that it might be an update of the timeline. No, this is the setting book of Eberron for 5th edition. Eberron is probably my favorite D&D setting. Let's say my second favorite because I do have my own homebrew one that we do on my Twitch show, Typecast RPG, called Veyron, and that's awesome. And if today is Tuesday, you can watch it tonight. Just look for Typecast RPG on Twitch, and it's awesome. But Eberron, we'll say that's a close second to my own personal one that I developed with my friends. Um, Eberron came from a contest in 2003. And so third edition had been out for a while. I don't think they'd hit 3.5 yet, but I don't remember the exact timeline. Anyway, Wizards of the Coast had produced a number of different settings, and it had updated some of its old settings for the new edition, for third. And then they had a contest where they said, hey, come up with a cool setting and submit them. There were 11,000 submissions, including at least 3 from me. I don't remember exactly what I submitted there, but it was at least 3. I know I co-wrote one with another friend. We were all in college, or no, 2003, we were just after college, but we were still super excited about this thing. And so we submitted a bunch of them. Some of my favorite older D&D settings are the weird ones. Stuff like Spelljammer and Planescape, and especially Dark Sun. Dark Sun was the first time I really said, you know what, I definitely have to pick up this game and try it out. Prior to Dark Sun, I had never actually played D&D at all. And so all of the settings that I was creating for this contest were similar in that they were very weird and they were very different, and they were like, hey, let's take this in a totally different direction. And in a sense, that's kind of what Eberron does. But Eberron was a lot more clever about it than I was being. And you can tell why Eberron won the contest. What Eberron did is it changed not so much the major details, it is mostly different in tone. And it loves to describe itself as a pulp adventure setting, as a noir setting. I think maybe the best way to describe this is to tell you that Eberron, whereas most D&D campaigns, you know, the kind of the base stuff, high fantasy tends to be like 1400s, War of the Roses, medieval Europe kind of era. Eberron is like 1920s. And so there is magic. There's skyscrapers, there's airships, there's trains, there's newspapers, there's a postal system, there's robots, which we didn't really have in the 1920s. But what they did is, or Keith Baker did, the designer of the setting, is he kind of took this idea of post-war recovery and economic boom, and he slotted it into this epic high fantasy setting where magic was just everywhere. Um, and so, like the trains, the robots, the airships, all that stuff I talked about, that's all magic. There's magic in every part of this setting. There's magic technology everywhere. It's kind of steampunky, but really think of it more as mage punky, to the extent that mage punk is even a word that has any meaning. There is technology everywhere, but it is all magic based. And rather notably, there aren't really guns. I don't remember gunpowder really being a thing in the setting. But anything that you want to do, and anything that you could feasibly do in kind of a 1920s era, you can do in Eberron with magic instead of normal technology. And so it does end up having this very kind of pulpy feel to it. There are gangsters. There's Indiana Jones jungle exploration. There's airships. There's, all of this kind of, you know, Indiana Jonesy is the best description of it, um, which is more 30s than 20s, but still, that's what they're going for, and they do it really well. So I think one of the reasons that it works, and one of the reasons that the setting has become so incredibly popular, is that it creates its differences. It differentiates itself from other D&D settings, not by restricting you the way that Dark Sun and Spelljammer and stuff like that did, but by just adding more stuff. Anything you want to do in a game of D&D, you can do in Eberron, plus there's more. So that's what it's doing. Let's have a look here. Let's start by looking at the map. So we're going to switch over. Okay, once again, I'm not looking at the PDF of the book. I am looking at the D&D Beyond website that has everything here. So hooray for D&D Beyond, which is wonderful. And they've got, the full table of contents, everything in it. We're actually going to start by jumping. We're going to talk about this gazetteer stuff, but we're going to do it by looking at this world map. So you can't see this super well because it's a little small on your screen, but Khyber is the main continent. That's where most of your story is likely to take place. Arenal is kind of where the elves live, and I love the elves in this setting because, at least the ones in Arenal, there's 2 or 3 different kingdoms of them up here in Khyber as well. The big kind of elven kingdom island continent thing of Arenal, they worship death and undeath, and so the elves are the liches and the things of that setting. In fact, back when this game came out in 2004, we started. Eberron is my longest running campaign of all time. It lasted 3 or 4 years, and in that group was Brandon Sanderson. We went to college together. We played D&D. We still do when we can. He loves playing evil magic users, and so he went immediately to an Arenal elf. And so while the rest of us were playing, little adventurers who were like in their mid-20s, like we all were in 2004, he was playing like a 300-year-old elven lich, using the wizard rules. And he had everyone carry, I think he actually had undead skeletons carrying him around on a palanquin everywhere he went because he was so old and he was so important that he didn't have to walk. And it was great, and we all loved it. Anyway, so down here, Zendrik. This is kind of the New World continent, right? This is the Amazon jungle and or the African Serengeti. This is the unexplored wilderness continent that is a common trope in 1920s adventure fiction. Zendrik used to be controlled by this giant empire of giants that would span the continent, and they were incredibly huge and powerful, and then they all died, and their ruins are there. And so this is the dangerous wilderness that you can go and explore. Over here, the other hemisphere, Arganessen, is a continent that is ruled by dragons, and people are not allowed on there. And so you're not likely to ever go there. But if you are a barbarian who worships dragons, you might have come from there in order to adventure somewhere else. Sarlona is ruled by these kind of psychic otherworldly beings called the Kori. They come from a land called Dalkor, and they are interesting in their own right. And I used to have the splat books for all of this stuff back in 3 and 3.5. And Sarlona is a continent of just pure, unrepentant evil. Everyone there is a villain except for one little tiny group that lives in one of these mountains somewhere. And they were the Kalashtar, who were like the good guy psychics. So anyway, that's the basic layout. Let's take a look at Khyber itself. And you know what you cannot see very well on this map of Khyber? Really anything. If you have actual D&D Beyond, you can see this pretty well, but I worry it's too small on your screen. So we're going to jump over to World Anvil, where there is an endlessly scrollable version of this map where you can see things a little better. And someone posted it for their campaign, so Morgoth is popping up. Okay, so I told you that Eberron is kind of post Great War in the same way that the 1920s were for Earth. There, this used to be ruled by 5 kingdoms, and then there was a 100-year-long war that devastated everything, and it was called the Last War because they are very much hoping that no one ever fights again. And that war ended about 4 years ago. And so you get that same sense of post-war recovery and of, oh my gosh, so many people have died and most of the adults have served in the war or were touched in the war by some way or by the war. And so, stop popping up. So you've got this, and it's splintered now into, I think, 13 different kingdoms, including some that never could have risen before in the 5 Kingdoms era. There's Droam here and Dargun, which are kind of like goblinoid monster kingdoms, quote unquote monster. Um, Eberron treats, and you can see this here if we look at the table of contents, Eberron treats a lot of goblinoids and orcs and half orcs and stuff as just full on player races. Normally, in most settings, if you want to be an orc, you got to be a half orc. In Eberron, be a goblin, be a hobgoblin, be a, I don't know if you can be a bugbear. You can be an orc though, because they are considered to be like what would typically be a monster race. In Eberron, you can actually play. Though you're unlikely to be able to play a demon unless you have a very forgiving GM. So they've got all this stuff. There's like the wildernessy, foresty druid kingdom. There's the Talenta Plains where halflings ride on dinosaurs. Mror Holds is kind of this big dwarven thing up here. Lazar Principalities, this is the Caribbean and the pirates and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a little bit of everything all over. Kabara is like lizard folk. Down here specifically, let's zoom in. You can see the shape of this river is kind of like a dagger. There's the hilt, there's the handle, and then here's this twisty little dagger, and it's called the Dagger River. Right here. Oh, my battery's running low. Well, we got to get this done quick then. Right here's the city of Sharn. And Sharn is enormous. Sharn is the New York City or the Paris or the Tokyo or the Shanghai or whatever of this setting. It is a massive city where you can do everything. And when I say massive, I am not kidding about that. Let's find a good boink, a good look at Sharn. So Sharn, you can see where we saw the map. The Dagger River is right here, and here's the hilt. This side is just mountains, and so there's nowhere for the city to grow out. But because the city is in an incredibly useful place in the mouth of this giant river with a protected bay, and it's near to where you can get out and go sail over to Arenal or Zendrik, it's an important city. So it grew, and it had nowhere to grow but up. So you can see here, these tops of the towers and buildings in the upper city, those are like a mile high. And I don't mean that they are a mile above sea level. They are. What I mean is that the buildings themselves, from top to base, are a mile high. And then there are bridges constantly all throughout connecting all of this stuff together. And then floating above the mile high towers, there's a place called the Skyway that is literally just a floating island built on solidified cloud. And if you go down under it, the city of Sharn was built on top of an old goblin city. Or no, it was built on top of an older human city that was destroyed by evil magic. And that older human city was built on top of an old goblin city. And that old goblin city was built on top of who knows what. And then underneath that, of course, are the lava pools. And so it doesn't go down a mile into the ground, but it goes pretty far. And you literally could spend an entire campaign, not just an adventure, but a campaign, never leaving this city. There is so much to do there. There is so much stuff. And as you can see from the table of contents, it gets an entire chapter with a lot of description. It's full of important governments, universities, criminal families, anything that you would want to do in like a great big fancy 1920s era city, you can do it in Sharn. Sharn's a great setting. So there's a ton of really interesting world information already. And then we get into, the other continents like the Lich Elves in Erenal and then places in Zendrik. Down underneath all of that is Khyber. And I wonder if we can get a good look at, there's Khyber. So Khyber is basically, so there are 3 dragons in the Eberron cosmology. There's the dragon Eberron, who is like the planet, the Earth dragon, the whatever, and he represents the planet that everyone is on, the world. And then there is Khyber, who is like the evil dragon. He's the underworld dragon. And so if you go down into the caves, if you go underground, you're going to be, that's called going into Khyber. And Khyber is fascinating because, first of all, there's like an underdarky kind of area that's full of drow and dwergar and all the classic stuff that is under the ground in a D&D setting. But then also there's a bunch of underground like planes, extra little planar pockets and dimensions and things that are connected to each other in weird ways. And so if you dig too deep, very classic Moria style, and this literally happened to the Mror holes, the dwarves that are up here in the corner. These dwarves dug too deep and they ran into some bad guys. They didn't just find these caves underground where monsters live. They broke through a chunk of rock and opened up into one of these subterranean planar dimensions that are inhabited by demons and monsters and all of these things. And you can go into one in one place and then pop up in the other side of the continent or in a different continent altogether because they do not follow the rules of geography. So there's a lot of stuff to do. So no matter where you go, the reason I'm telling you all of this stuff about Khyber and about Sharn, about everything else, the world is incredibly rich. The world is incredibly well described, while A, still leaving enough room for you to make up your own stuff, and B, giving you a lot of cool ideas. If you want to face any particular kind of monster, the odds are good that it's somewhere around. A monster or an evil organization or a religion or a whatever, you can find the foes you want to find somewhere in Eberron. And if there's something you want to invent, go away, that is not here, well then you just go down probably to Zendrik and you slap it in there. The other thing you can do is the Mournlands. So this big white thing in the middle, that's the Mournlands. Think of No Man's Land in World War I, except it never recovered. There was, for reasons unknown, some awful thing happened. This used to be a kingdom called Sire. All that's really left of Sire is this lake. And then one day, this magical thing just spread out and destroyed Sire and killed everyone or drove them mad. And it didn't follow the exact borders of Sire. A lot of Dargoon used to be part of Sire, different parts of these other things. But what it did was it scared the crap out of everybody because they didn't know if maybe it happened because of all the war magic that was being used, or if maybe someone had actually done it on purpose. Like if this was the magical equivalent of a nuclear bomb that destroyed everything. I guess in that sense, it's not so much No Man's Land as it is Hiroshima, but just still irradiated, still unlivable, still horrible, and nobody knew who dropped the bomb in this version of the story. So the point is, the Mournlands ended the war because they'd been fighting for 100 years. They had been living through all of these, trials and atrocities and all of this stuff, and then this scary magical thing happened freaked everybody out, and they said, we'd better stop fighting before this happens anywhere else. And so they came up with a treaty, and it's called the Treaty of Thronehold. And so that's kind of one of the defining elements of the world politically, because it's what's keeping the last war the last war. Nobody wants to break that treaty, start fighting again, and potentially cause another Mournland. It's also yet another scary place that you can go and visit when you are adventuring in Eberron, right? You can go to Khyber, you can go to Sarlona, you can go to the Mournlands, and there's plenty of things you can do inside of that kind of wasteland magical place. So, last of all, before we just get to the last thing, let's talk about the characters. I mentioned a little bit that you can play orcs and goblins and that kind of stuff as player characters in this setting. It also has a couple of original characters or character races like changelings, who are basically, you know, what they sound like. They can shapeshift so that they look like other people. That sounds like a very powerful power, and it is, but they've balanced them pretty well. You've also got the Kalishtar, which I mentioned. They are like the good guy psychics. They're the core who come from, you know, the other evil psychic dreaming plane called the Dreaming Dark. They're evil and they possess people. And there's also good versions of them, and they possess good people. And then they become the Kalishtar. And so they've got some neat little abilities. Basically, they're just psychic. And they're a lot of fun. And then there are my favorite, which are shifters. Shifters are vaguely lycanthropic. They're not full-blown werewolves, but there's I think 4 different flavors of them: Beasthide, Longtooth, Swiftstride, and Wildhunt. And they each have their little powers, and they can kind of wolf out slightly to gain special abilities. They'll have a couple of attribute bonuses, and then once per day or whatever, they can go kind of full bear or cat or whatever it is that they're trying to do. And this was my character class. When we played that long, like 3-year campaign, I was a shifter, and he was fantastic. And I can't imagine ever playing this game and not being a shifter, because I love them so much. The robots that I mentioned are called the Warforged. And the Warforged have been a part of D&D long enough now that you've probably seen them, even if you've never played Eberron. They are weapons, kind of autonomous weapon systems that were invented for the last war. And then when the war ended, the Treaty of Thronehold granted them autonomy, granted them independence. They are people legally, and they can go anywhere and do anything, and you can't own them, and you can't like force them to fight for you and things like that. Though, because they were built for war, a lot of them have become mercenaries. So they are a really neat aspect of Eberron as well. In the original, like 3rd edition version of Eberron, all of these races, in particular Shifters and Warforged, had a ton of feats where you could kind of really lean in to that aspect of them and say, well, I'm not just a Warforged, I'm a Warforged whose hand is a mace, and I can do this and I can do this, and kind of upgrade yourself with feats. In 5th edition, because of the way the game system works, that's not really around anymore. But what it has done is it has smoothed all of that out so that it is... I mean, that's the hallmark of 5th edition, right? You can do anything you want, and it's relatively easy. There's not a bunch of numbers to crunch and not a lot of extra things. One of the other really neat things that they've done with 5th edition is the way they've handled dragon marks. The dragon marks are another aspect of how magic prevalent this setting is. There's magic everywhere. There's a new character class called the Artificer that can build cool magical things. And then there's also dragon marks. And those are basically birthmarks or kind of naturally occurring tattoos that have magical powers. And they are all connected to great houses. So they are, to some extent, genetic. And so if you are, for example, in the, let's look at this one, the Mark of Storm. This is House Lyrindar. They are the ones who have the Dragon Mark of Storm. And so they have, first of all, they're, I think, mostly half-elf, but I think they can also be human. Anyway, um, I think you have to be a half-elf in order to get it. So all of the dragon marks, first of all, are designed as if they were subraces. So you can be a normal half-elf, or you can be some other half-elf subrace, or you can be the House Lyrindar Mark of Storm half-elf subrace. And what that does is you don't have to spend any feats on it. You don't have to do any of this other stuff. You just pick this as your starting species, and then you get these abilities, you get these cool little powers, and then you get some other stuff that you can do. And then also, you of course are connected in story terms to House Lyrindar, which is in charge of all the airships, and I think also in charge of the train system, because of the way that their mark lets them do all this stuff. So the dragon marks are neat, and I like the way that they are handled, where they are treated now as subraces. You also can have aberrant dragon marks, which are you're not really part of an existing house. You just developed a dragon mark for no reason, and then people are afraid of you, or people want to recruit you, or people want to kill you because they don't want a new house arising out of somewhere. And so you can kind of design your own subrace, so to speak, and your own neat little thing, and you get, a cantrip that you can use based on your dragon mark. So it's a neat little storytelling thing. And then, of course, I already mentioned the Artificer. This is something that if you've got D&D Beyond, they just kind of added this recently to the list of classes. And so if you're playing Eberron, this is what it's from, and it's actually a really neat, well-designed class. They have integrated it very well into 5th edition, so hooray for that! Now, let's take a look as a last thing. This is the last thing I wanted to say that I got to, the adventure opportunities. I've already talked about how cool this setting is and about how much stuff there is. There's things to explore, there's things to do. The book includes 3 chapters about how to use all of this stuff to tell good stories, right? So if you want to do something with the Dreaming Dark and the Kalishtar, we've got a whole section on that. If you want to deal with Khyber, who is the dragon below, well, we can deal with all that. And he has his own cult, and he does all this own stuff. Droam is one of those monster kingdoms that I was talking about. So there's a lot of basic stuff. And not all of these are evil organizations. The Gatekeepers are actually a group of druids who are designed to protect the natural world. And they will go out and they will fight aberrations and other otherworldly encroachers and invaders who are coming into Eberron to mess with it. So, in a campaign that is centered around the Dreaming Dark or the Dragon Below, you might have some gatekeepers in your group or be all gatekeepers. Anyway, this is a lot of things you can use, a lot of information, a lot of stuff you can draw on. And then, of course, the chapter begins with, well, how can we use all of this stuff? How can we design a campaign in Eberron using all of its options to create something exciting? There's also a system in here of group patrons. So if your player group gets together and you want to provide a little bit of guidance or structure to the way the campaign is set up, you could say something like, well, you work for a head of state. And then you click that, and it takes you here, and it gives you an example head of state, someone from New Sire, which is the stragglers who survived the Mournland and managed to escape. But there's other options as well. So if you have your patron be a head of state, these are the kind of assignments you can get, the kind of expenses you will have, the kind of diplomatic immunity you will get, the money you will get, the different kinds of people you're likely to have in your group, and then so on and so on, the different affairs that you'll have to deal with. And it has this for all of these different options, whether you want to be part of a crime syndicate, an adventurers guild, a newspaper, a military force, a religious group. There's a lot of different patrons that, again, can provide structure to the type of adventure you're telling. Last of all, of course, there's treasure and there's monsters, all of these kind of everything in the basic monster books, like Volo's Guide to Monsters, the Monster Manual, all of that you can use in Eberron. but it also has its own specific things. So living spells, magical spells in the Mournlands that kind of were granted not necessarily sentience, but at least they're still around and still doing things. If you want to deal with the Quarry, who are those psychic dudes, if you want to deal with all of this stuff, you can. And then last of all, the adventure. There's an actual adventure. Oh, that I probably shouldn't show you here because it looks like it's got some spoilery stuff. Um, it's just kind of a starting adventure to give you a sense of what Eberron is like. And it starts with the characters being summoned by their old buddy that they used to fight with in the last war, or they have some connection to. And she works now as a police officer in Sharn and says, "Hey, I need you to come help me out. There's this issue that I have." And it spins off into some different intrigue and lets you explore the city a little bit, lets you discover some of the politics a little bit. It's a really neat short adventure that's designed to introduce you to the setting, and it's really cool. So that is Eberron. It is a very rich setting. It's a very well-developed setting. It's been around through 3.5 editions of the game now, and they've done a really good job of adapting it into 5th, taking advantage of the things Eberron's very good at, the things 5th edition is very good at, combining them together. It's a really great setting. So I do like this a lot. I think you will like it a lot. And I hope that you get a chance at some point to try Eberron. I thank you for watching this, and I'll see you on my next review. Bye!